if we want to be ahead of the curve, let's foster innovation and allow for these products to be listed, regulated, invested in, because we now know this is not this is an irreversible future in the asset management industry.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. Joining me today is Finecchia International CEO Bandeep Singh Rangar. Bandeep, very good to speak with you again. We're chatting about the growth in ETPs, in fact, crypto ETPs coming to market, and we have seen this gaining momentum in 2025. Do you see it continuing?
Yeah, look, that's been the big story for the past year, right? You'll recall this watershed moment when the US approved ETFs that were backed by Bitcoin, and soon after that, Ethereum. Now, at that point, we saw a flow of about $40 billion into US based ETFs. Well, that number is now about 120 billion worldwide, right? So that's been a growth that was, kind of waiting to happen, right? The floodgates have opened. Is that a once, in a moment history event, or is that a trend? I think the fact that it's gone from that number that I mentioned to you, 40 to about 120, and if you take year on year, it's gone, about a double from 60 billion to about 120 billion. I think this is the beginning of something big.
Are we also seeing, apart from retail investors, are we also seeing institutional adoption of crypto ETPs?
That's really what's driving it, right? Because when you buy an ETP, and ETPs are effectively exchange traded products, which is like the universal set for ETFs, which you're more familiar with in North America, exchange traded funds. In Europe, they tend to take the shape of ETCs or ETNs, exchange traded commodities or exchange traded notes. The whole reason for having a listed security, which effectively is denominating a value for an underlying digital asset or a crypto asset, is to make it accessible to investors. And you make it accessible because it's like buying a share in Microsoft or MicroStrategy or any other company you're familiar with in whichever jurisdiction you live in, as simply as going on your laptop or your phone and clicking and buying a security. So is it open to retail investors? Absolutely. This is something that makes democratizes access to institutional quality crypto asset backed securities.
How about the push for the inclusion of crypto in mainstream investment funds? Are there advocates for that?
Yeah, there's a big push right now to basically qualify such investments under, for example, in Europe, we have UCITS schemes, and there's other measures in the US to basically give clarity, if nothing else, give clarity. Because in the past, there's been regulations for enforcement, and you couldn't tell if a specific digital asset was a security or not. And within that framework, if it fit under a UCITS framework, if it qualified for in Europe, as you might be familiar, the AIFMD, the Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive. So giving some clarity on the treatment then drives, of course, adoption, because then wealth managers and private bankers can offer that to their clients. Without that clarity, even if they wanted to, and even if they believed it was an investable asset, the risk was too great in terms of which way the regulations might flip. And in the past, obviously, people have been fined for being in the wrong set of regulation, which wasn't clear in the first place. So this whole drive towards institutional adoption and retail propagation is predicated upon getting qualified notes from regulators across the world as to how such assets are treated.
We've talked about the United States and Europe, Bandeep. How about the launch of crypto ETPs in new markets? Are we seeing that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, Europe took the lead, and the way I see it, in the US and Canada, we still have kind of generation one of ETPs and ETFs, which are pretty much buy and hold ETPs, right, or ETFs. And those are largely around Bitcoin and Ethereum, the top big coins in the market. We're now seeing the approvals for other coins in the US and Canada, such as Solana, Ripple, Sui, as amongst other ones. In Europe, they've always been accepted. And in Europe, you actually have kind of generation two, which is yield, particularly from staking protocols and getting, staking pools. Yield for ETP holders has been great. We pushed the envelope, of course, with a DeFi-based product, which is decentralized finance, which arguably has a higher yield and you get a greater exposure to on-chain activities. So that's generation three. Now, that's been followed in other jurisdictions, whether it's the UK now, where the LSE is accepting digital asset-backed ETPs, and similar in other jurisdictions in Hong Kong and Singapore and Australia, and certainly South America. So that worldwide adoption is continuing. The question will be, how far does each jurisdiction go? And are they going to follow the lead? Are they going to wait for the big players to move? Or are they going to take a leapfrog approach and say, look, if you want to be ahead of the curve, let's foster innovation and allow for these products to be listed, regulated, invested in, because we now know this is not, this is an irreversible future in the asset management industry.
Bandeep, you mentioned yield-bearing ETPs. Could you expand on that, please?
Sure. Look, in the past, there was a desire amongst investors to effectively just get exposure to crypto assets. As more institutions move in that direction, they're also adopting what our traditional finance approach is, which is one thing to have the asset. The other thing is to get yield, regardless of the movement of the underlying currency. In the past year, there's about 240 ETPs worldwide, by the way, that are backed by crypto assets. And in the past year, about 40 of them have been yield-bearing assets, half of which have been launched in the past year. So if you look at that proportion, half of the new ones that are out there of these 40 ones are yield-bearing. That's a trend that we are seeing, and that's probably a trend that's going to grow.
So, I mean, you mentioned Solana, Bandeep. I mean, are there any notable new cryptocurrency ETF filings in the US at the moment, apart from Solana?
Yeah, I think Sui, Ripple are the two ones, and it's interesting to see these ones that are being filed, kind of mirroring what is being discussed as the components of the US digital asset or cryptos asset reserve, right? This whole strategic reserve being discussed by Donald Trump's administration as a composition of different coins. And it's not a surprise that some of the coins that are being touted as being the members of this strategic reserve are also the ones that are being pursued in terms of ETP or ETF applications. Will it go so far, and will we see a meme coin one? Potentially, that'd be interesting and exciting. I don't know if it'll happen in the US, but potentially in Europe.
You mentioned the irreversible path, Bandeep. So is crypto here to stay as a mainstream investment open to all retail investors?
Look, it's been the best performing asset, Bitcoin certainly, for the past 10 years. It's the single most ultimately infinitely divisible monetary unit. Its its use cases have grown, not just in terms of Bitcoin or Ethereum, but also stable coins. $27 trillion worth of transactions took place in stable coins last year. It's 40% of all on-chain transactions are there. So if there was any question about its future, that should be eminently removed. I think the only question is, how do you treat them? What regulations you put around them? How far do you go in terms of accepting the myriads of new coins that are coming out there? I think that's where the future is going to kind of unfold. But there's no question in my mind, and I think right now it's people who opt out are opting out of a future that's going to be as exciting and potentially as rewarding as it has been for the past decade.
Bandeep, thanks as always for your insights. It's been great speaking with you today.
Likewise, thanks for having me, Stephen.
That's Finekia International CEO Bandeep Singh Rangar.